The worst thing about being sold was that no one called it that. They used other words: arrangement, opportunity, honor. Her stepmother had said honor with such practiced warmth that Bonnie had almost believed it, standing in the great hall of Ashford Keep, with her hands folded over the front of her linen dress, and the smell of beeswax candles burning too close to her face. Almost. But Bonnie had learned, across 23 years of careful observation, that the prettier the word, the uglier the thing underneath it. She had not slept the night before, not from excitement, from the particular stillness that settles into a body when it already knows something the mind is still refusing to accept. The hall was full that morning. Lords and minor pack representatives lined the long benches, their boots tracking mud and pine resin across the stone floor. The fire in the central hearth burned high despite the mild weather, and the smoke curled upward through the iron grate in lazy ribbons. Bonnie stood at the edge of the gathering, half hidden behind a carved pillar, watching her stepmother, Maris, move through the crowd with the fluid ease of a woman who had spent her entire life making herself agreeable to powerful men. Maris was beautiful in the way expensive furniture is beautiful. Designed to impress, impossible to get comfortable with. She was speaking to Lord Davin, the pack representative from the northern reaches, and whatever she was saying made him laugh. A short, dismissive sound. His eyes drifted past Maris's shoulder and landed briefly on Bonnie before sliding away, disinterested. Bonnie had grown used to that look. She was not the kind of woman rooms turned to notice. She was quiet, pale-haired, unremarkable in presentation, if not in perception. Her voice was the one thing people remembered, that startling, cavernous thing that seemed to come from somewhere older than her body. She had been singing since she could form words, and she had learned early that her voice was the only currency she possessed in a house that ran entirely on calculation. It was, apparently, now being spent. "You'll perform one piece," Maris had told her 3 days ago, folding Bonnie's traveling cloak with the brisk efficiency of someone checking tasks off a list. Something simple, modest, a traditional offering song, the kind the old packs expect at a king's gathering. You will not improvise. You will not embellish. You will stand still, sing clearly, curtsy, and leave the stage. "And after?" Bonnie had asked. Maris had smiled without showing her teeth. "After, Lord Davin will confirm the arrangement with the Ashford name behind it. Your voice will have served its purpose. Your voice, not you, never you." She had not asked what the arrangement was, because she had understood, in the way women in precarious positions learn to understand things, not through confrontation but through accumulated silence, that the answer would not be something she wanted to hold in her hands before she had to. Now, watching Maris laugh again at something Lord Davin said, Bonnie felt the familiar cold weight settle behind her sternum. Not fear exactly. Something more patient than fear. Awaiting. The gathering was in preparation for the Alpha King's formal progress through the outer territories. Once every 7 years, King Lucian of the Iron Crown made the circuit of his lands, not as an invitation to celebration, but as assessment. Territories that could not demonstrate order, tribute, and cultural loyalty risked reallocation. Packlands absorbed, bloodlines reassigned. It was not cruelty. It was simply the architecture of power, and everyone inside it knew the rules. Ashford was a small holding. Maris had married into it, and then Bonnie's father had died, and then Maris had spent 4 years quietly hollowing the estate of everything that had once given it weight. The timber contracts were gone. The merchant alliances were gone. The pack warriors who had owed fealty to the Ashford name had been quietly redirected toward more lucrative allegiances. What remained was the name, the bloodline, and Bonnie. She pressed her back against the pillar and closed her eyes for one breath. Behind her lids, something happened that she could never fully explain, had never been able to explain, not to her father when he was alive, not to the old healer woman who had once lived in the valley below the keep and listened without judgment. It was not a vision exactly. Not darkness and light rearranging themselves into images. It was more like a pressure, the way the air changes before a storm, when the birds go quiet and the leaves turn their pale undersides upward. A gathering of something just outside the range of ordinary sense. It had been happening more frequently in the past weeks, always at the edges of sleep, or in moments of stillness like this one. A sensation she associated with wrongness, not danger approaching from outside, but betrayal already present, already inside the walls. She opened her eyes. Maris was watching her now. The laughter had stopped. Lord Davin had moved away, and Maris stood alone near the hearth with her hands clasped, and her expression composed in that particular way that meant she was calculating. She held Bonnie's gaze for one measured moment, then looked away. The pressure behind Bonnie's sternum sharpened. She moved. Not toward Maris, not toward the gathering. Toward the east corridor, which led to the smaller rooms behind the great hall. The counting room, the steward's quarters, the narrow staircase that went up to the gallery where documents were stored. She moved with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent years making herself small in crowded rooms, and no one watched her go. The counting room door was partially ajar. She had not meant to stop there, had not chosen to stop there. But the pressure in her chest was almost physical now, a hand flat against her sternum, pushing, and her feet simply did not carry her past. She heard Maris's voice first. Not laughing now. Clipped. Efficient. The voice Maris used when she believed no one who mattered was listening. Won't be a problem. The girl has no idea what the contract actually specifies. Lord Davin's response was lower, harder to catch. But Bonnie heard the word territory, and the word signed, and then something that made the counting room walls seem to tilt slightly on their foundations. Her own name, spoken in the context of collateral. She pressed herself flat against the wall beside the door and breathed through her nose. Slowly. Carefully. Once the king confirms Ashford's position at the gathering, Maris continued, the secondary documents transfer automatically. The girl's inheritance, the original Ashford land grants from her father's line, becomes part of the Northern Reaches Compact. She'll have nothing to contest it with. No pack standing, no legal witness, no alpha to speak for her. And the voice performance? Davin asked. Cover. Nothing more. Something for the record to show she participated willingly in the gathering festivities. It establishes her presence without giving her agency. A pause. The sound of parchment. She'll think she's honoring her family name. She'll stand on that stage and sing her modest little song, and by the time she understands what she signed away by proxy, the window will have closed. Bonnie did not move for a very long time. The fire crackled in the great hall beyond. Somewhere outside, horses were being moved across the courtyard stones, hooves ringing sharp against the cold granite. She could smell pine smoke and something herbal, dried rosemary maybe from the kitchen corridor, and underneath it, faint and nauseating, the waxy sweetness of the candles. Her hands were flat against the wall. She could feel the roughness of old stone under her palms. 23 years. She had spent 23 years inside this house believing that whatever her stepmother's coldness was made of, it had limits, that there was a floor beneath the calculation, some bedrock of basic human restraint. That honor, even when used as a tool, still meant something recognizable. She had been wrong. The land, her father's land, the Ashford grants that had been in the bloodline for 4 generations, the forest holdings, the river territory, the village tithe rights that were the last real thing her father had left her when he died. Maris was selling them, had already sold them, was using Bonnie's own performance, her own willing presence at the king's gathering, to make the theft look like consent. And there was nothing noble about the plan. No desperation, no grief, no terrible necessity. Just appetite. Clean and simple. Bonnie pushed off from the wall. Her jaw was tight. Her breath came evenly. She made it come evenly, because the alternative was to stand in a cold corridor and make noise, and she was not going to do that. She was not going to give Maris the satisfaction of a reaction that could be managed. She walked back toward the great hall with her chin level, and her eyes forward, and the sound of her own heartbeat very loud in her ears. She was going to sing at the Alpha King's gathering, but she was not going to sing a modest little song. The stage was not grand by any measure that mattered to the lords assembled in Thornfield's great convocation hall. A long rectangular platform of dark oak boards, set at the far end of an enormous vaulted room, flanked by iron torch brackets and draped at the back with the territorial banners of every pack that owed fealty to the Iron Crown. But to Bonnie, standing in the narrow preparation corridor behind it, with her gray cloak still fastened at the throat and her single braid pulled over one shoulder, it looked exactly like what it was. The last place she had any power left to use. She had 3 hours before the performance. 3 hours in which Maris believed her to be resting in the modest room assigned to Ashford's delegation, a room with a low ceiling, a single window overlooking the stable yard, and a lock that turned from the outside. Maris had not locked it. There had been no need to, she must have reasoned. Bonnie had never run before. She had used the window, not in panic. Methodically, the way her father had taught her to think through problems. Piece by piece, without flinching at any individual piece. She had removed her traveling boots before climbing down the exterior stonework, so the leather soles would not scrape, had replaced them at the bottom, had walked across the stable yard in the long shadow of the east wall without hurrying. Speed attracted attention. Deliberate movement did not. She had found the convocation hall through the servant passages, following the smell of torch oil and the distant sound of harps being tuned in the upper gallery. The musicians were rehearsing their processional arrangements for the king's entrance. Not for another 2 hours, the senior steward had told her when she'd intercepted him in the corridor, and explained with perfect composure that she was the Ashford voice gift performer and needed to assess the stage acoustics before the evening. He had looked at her, the unremarkable blonde woman with the gray cloak and the careful eyes, and seen nothing threatening. He had nodded and pointed her toward the preparation corridor, and forgotten her before he turned the corner. She stood at the edge of the stage now, looking out at the empty hall. It was extraordinary when it was quiet. The vaulted ceiling climbed 40 feet above the stone floor, crossed by heavy timber beams darkened with age and smoke. The walls were dressed stone interrupted by high windows, most of them shuttered against the evening cold, their iron latches casting thin shadows in the torchlight. The banners moved faintly in the drafts, deep reds and blacks, and the dark green of the forest packs, each one embroidered with its alpha's mark. The hall could seat 400. Tonight it would hold more. And somewhere in the center of it, in the carved chair on the raised dais that the stewards were currently dragging into position with a great scraping of stone, the Alpha King would sit. Bonnie had never seen King Lucian. No one she knew had, personally. He existed in the outer territories as a force of geography more than a person, the way mountains existed, or the deep current in the river that could take a boat if the helmsman lost attention. You oriented your life around him without looking directly at him. She crossed to the center of the stage and stood still. The acoustics hit her immediately. The hall was not merely large. It was designed to carry sound, the ceiling angles calculated in that old architectural tradition that predated even the Pack territories, built by craftsmen who understood resonance as a kind of sacred technology. Her smallest exhale came back to her changed, warmer, fuller. The room would do things with her voice that no room in Ashford Keep had ever done. She closed her eyes and let herself feel it. The cold air. The smell of old stone and pine resin and the faint ghost of hundreds of meals served in this hall across decades. Torch smoke, the distant sound of the musicians upstairs, the pressure in her chest that had been there since the corridor, still there, still exact, but quieter now. Clarified. She knew what she was going to do. Maris had told her to sing a traditional offering song, simple, modest, brief, something ceremonial and forgettable. The kind of performance that produced polite appreciation and absolutely no lasting impression. A voice gift that fulfilled the formal requirement of cultural participation without creating any record that might later be questioned. A transaction dressed as art. Bonnie was going to sing Nara's Lament. It was not a simple song. It was arguably the most demanding piece in the entire canon of the old Pack oral tradition. A composition so technically complex and emotionally consuming that most trained singers avoided it entirely. It required a range that crossed 4 distinct registers, a breath control that the old teachers compared to holding fire in cupped hands, and an emotional surrender that very few performers could sustain for its full 11 minutes without the voice breaking or the performance collapsing into something smaller than the song deserved. Bonnie had been practicing it privately for 4 years. Her father had taught her the first movement before he died. He had known what it was, had known that she had the voice for it, that rare instrument that came along perhaps once in a generation and could actually carry the piece without technical compromise. He had told her to save it. For something that matters, he had said, sitting in the library while the fire burned low and she was still young enough to sit at his feet on the hearthrug without it seeming strange. Don't spend it on a room that doesn't deserve it. She thought he would not object to tonight. The song was about a she-wolf who had been betrayed by her pack, stripped of her standing, and cast out during the deepest winter. It was not triumphant. It did not end in restoration or revenge. It ended in something more unsettling. The moment she stood at the edge of a frozen river and chose to keep walking. Not because she was saved, but because something in her refused to be finished by people who had never understood what she was worth. It was a song about dignity, maintained in the absolute absence of any external reason to maintain it. It was, Bonnie realized with a small and private clarity, the truest thing she had ever prepared to do. She stood on the empty stage and ran through the opening passage in her mind, feeling the architecture of it. The long-held note that opened like a door, the interval drop in the second phrase that produced a physical ache in listeners who didn't expect it, the way the melody climbed in the third movement until the room couldn't contain it. She did not sing. Not yet. She simply held the shape of it inside her chest and let herself feel how much she needed it. Then she opened her eyes. Lord Davin was standing at the far end of the hall. He had not been there when she arrived. He stood near the entrance arch, still in his traveling coat, with 2 men behind him, guards, by the look of them, wide-shouldered and watchful. He was looking directly at her, not with the dismissive inattention of that morning, but with something more focused, more calculating. He had followed her, or Maris had sent him. Bonnie did not move from the center of the stage. She stood exactly where she was, and met his gaze across the length of the empty hall, and something in the steadiness of her own stillness seemed to give him pause. He had expected, she suspected, to find her hiding, afraid, caught. She was none of those things. Not anymore. He said something to the men behind him. Then he walked forward, his boots loud on the stone floor, until he stood at the base of the stage looking up at her. This close, she could see the hard line of his mouth and the particular flatness behind his eyes that she recognized as the face of a man who had bought and sold many things and had stopped thinking about the difference. "You should be resting," he said. "The performance is in 3 hours." "I'm assessing the acoustics," she said. "I take my performances seriously." Something moved in his expression. Not quite surprise. Recalibration. "Your stepmother mentioned you were agreeable." "My stepmother," Bonnie said carefully, "says a great many things about me." The silence between them was thin as ice over deep water. "Sing your song tonight," Davin said finally, his voice dropping to something that was almost gentle and was not. "The simple one, the offering song. Do it properly, and this will all go smoothly for everyone." She looked at him, at the flatness, at the calculation. "Of course," she said. He held her gaze for 1 moment longer, then turned and walked back toward the entrance arch with his guards behind him. His footsteps echoed up through the vaulted ceiling and came back down changed, smaller, emptier. And then the great doors closed behind him and she was alone in the hall again. Bonnie let out one long, slow breath. The pressure in her chest was gone. In its place was something different. Not peace, not exactly. Something colder and more precise. A decision that had already finished making itself while she was still standing on a stage in an empty hall. Her father's last lesson burning somewhere underneath her ribs like a coal that had never gone fully dark. Don't spend it on a room that doesn't deserve it. Tonight, The room would deserve it. She walked off the stage, back through the preparation corridor, and began to think about what came after the song. The hall filled the way floodwater fills a low room. Quickly, completely, with no regard for anything that had been arranged there before. By the time the processional harps began their opening passage in the upper gallery, every bench was occupied, and the standing space along the walls had compressed into a single dense mass of wool cloaks, leather shoulders, and the particular tension of people who had traveled far and were not entirely sure what the evening would demand of them. The torch brackets had been fully lit, and the heat from 400 bodies and 24 open flames had turned the cold stone hall into something close and amber-colored, the air thick with tallow smoke and the smell of damp wool drying. Bonnie stood in the preparation corridor and waited. She had changed. Not into anything grand. Ashford's delegation had not packed for grandeur, and even if it had, Maris controlled the trunks. But she had found, in the small room where the performers' things were stored, a length of deep blue wool that someone had left folded over a chair. A practice wrap, probably, abandoned by a musician. She had used it to replace the gray cloak, draping it over her linen dress, and fastening it at one shoulder with the small bronze pin her father had given her the last winter before he died. It was not a costume. It was simply the difference between standing on a stage in the color of nothing and standing in the color of intention. Her braid was still her braid. She had not touched it. She could hear the hall beyond the heavy curtain that separated the corridor from the stage entrance. The processional had ended, which meant the king had been seated. There was a current of ceremony in the murmur of the crowd, a formality that came with the presence of real power in a room. She had heard that current before, in smaller versions, at lesser gatherings. Tonight it was something different, denser. A steward appeared at her elbow, young, nervous, holding a parchment. Ashford voice gift, your third in the program, after the Dawnfield Choir and before the Lord's formal address. Thank you, she said. He hesitated. The presenting Lord, Lord Davin, he gave instructions that your piece should be introduced as a traditional offering composition, approximately 3 minutes in length. Bonnie looked at the steward. He was perhaps 19, with ink stains on his fingers, and the expression of someone who knew he was carrying a message he didn't fully understand. Write down what I tell you, she said quietly. He blinked, lifted his parchment. Introduce me as Bonnie of Ashford, daughter of Lord Edric Ashford, presenting Nara's lament in the old tradition. That is the full introduction. Nothing else. The steward wrote it, did not question it, nodded once and disappeared back through the curtain, and Bonnie returned to her stillness. She thought about her father, not with grief exactly. She had moved through most of the grief years ago, in the long quiet of a house that became colder after he was gone. She thought about him with the particular precision of someone recalling instructions that had been given for exactly this moment. His voice when he was teaching, the way he had made her repeat difficult passages, not until she got them right, but until she stopped being afraid of them. Fear makes the voice small, he had said, and your voice was never made to be small. The Dawnfield Choir finished. Applause. Genuine, warm. They were good. Bonnie had listened to their rehearsal earlier through the stone wall and had appreciated their precision without envy. They sang beautifully. They did not sing the way she was about to sing. But that was not a competition. It was simply a fact of different instruments. The steward's voice carried through the curtain, announcing her name, her father's name, the name of the song. She heard the shift in the hall when the song title was recognized. A small collective intake, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Nara's lament was known. Its difficulty was known. The last public performance of it that anyone in the outer territories could likely remember had been at the previous king's coronation, 40 years past. She walked through the curtain and onto the stage. The heat of the hall came at her immediately, that wall of human warmth and torchlight. She did not rush toward the center mark. She walked to it at her own pace, her boots steady on the oak boards, the blue wool settling around her shoulders, and she stood still for one full breath before she raised her eyes. The hall was extraordinary when it was full. 400 faces, tiers of them along the benches, the standing crowd along the walls, the lords in their formal positions near the front. The banner colors moved softly overhead in the heated drafts. Everything was amber and shadow, and the bright points of torch flame, and at the center of the raised dais, in the carved chair that the stewards had placed with such deliberate ceremony, sat the Alpha King. She had not let herself look for him until this moment, had deliberately kept her gaze general, unfocused, the way she had learned to manage a large audience, seeing the whole room as a single presence rather than a collection of individuals. But the dais drew the eye the way fire drew it, by being the point around which everything else organized. Lucian of the Iron Crown was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something more like the word king, formal, dressed in ceremony, softened by the trappings of office. What she saw instead was a man who wore his authority the way old stone walls wear their age, not decorated, simply present. He was large in the way that came from actual use rather than display, broad through the shoulders, dressed in dark leather and a black fur mantle that looked like it had been worn on actual journeys and not taken down from a ceremonial hook. His hair was braided back from his face in the dark warrior tradition of the northern bloodlines, and even at this distance, 30 feet of torchlit hall between them, she was aware of his eyes on her with a precision that felt almost physical. He was already watching her. Not the way Lord Davin had watched her from the base of the stage that afternoon, calculating, assessing for utility. This was different. This was a man who watched the way territory watches, completely, without agenda, taking in everything at once. Bonnie looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she closed her eyes and sang. The opening note of Nara's lament was a single-held tone. Not high, not dramatic, nothing that announced itself as impressive. It was a middle note, a thinking note, the kind of tone that could belong to anyone. She held it for 4 full counts, and the hall went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected is happening and no one wants to be the one who breaks it with noise. Then she let the melody open. The first movement was grief. Not performed grief, the real architecture of it. The way it actually lived in the body, heavy and airless in the chest, the way it made everything slow and strange. Her father's compositions had always said that the first movement should feel like waking up and remembering. She sang it that way, not for the audience, for herself, for the man who had taught her, for the girl who had stood in a cold corridor that morning and heard her own name used as a line item in a transaction. By the time she reached the second movement, the hall was completely silent. Not quiet. Silent. The particular silence of 400 people who have collectively stopped thinking about anything except what they are hearing. She could feel it, the held breath of the room, and she carried it with her into the third movement where the melody climbed, where Nara's voice in the old story lifted above the frozen river and above the pack that had cast her out and above the winter that had tried to finish her, and kept climbing. And the hall's vaulted ceiling took the sound and held it, and gave it back transformed, and Bonnie let her voice go fully, completely, without reservation or apology, into the uppermost register where very few human voices had ever actually lived. And she stayed there. For 8 full measures she stayed in that place where the voice stopped being technique and became something else, something that the old traditions called lunar tone, the frequency at which, according to pack lore, the moon goddess herself could hear what was being sung, and the hall did not breathe, and the banners did not move, and the torch flames seemed to steady as though the air itself had paused to listen. The final movement brought her down, slowly, with dignity. Nara walking forward because she chose to. Not saved, not restored, simply continuing, which was its own kind of defiance. When the last note ended, Bonnie stood on the stage in the amber silence, her eyes open, her hands still at her sides, the blue wool cool now against her overheated skin. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the hall broke. Not polite applause. Something rawer than that. The sound of 400 people releasing a breath they had been holding without knowing it. It moved through the benches in a wave, rose to the vaulted ceiling, came back changed and larger. Bonnie looked at the dais. Lucian of the Iron Crown had not moved. He sat exactly as he had sat when she first walked onto the stage, large and still in his carved chair, the fur mantle dark at his shoulders. But something in his expression had shifted. Something almost imperceptible. The kind of change that was only visible to someone paying very close attention. He was not applauding. He was simply watching her with those gray eyes, steady and complete, as though he had come to this hall expecting ceremony and found something entirely different, and was still in the process of deciding what to do with that. From the far side of the hall, near the entrance arch, she could feel Lord Davin's gaze like a blade along the back of her neck. She curtsied, turned, walked off the stage. Her hands, she noticed when she reached the preparation corridor, were not shaking. She did not go back to the delegation room. There was no point. Maris would be there, or someone sent by Maris. And the conversation that waited in that room was one Bonnie was not prepared to have from a position of no resources and no time. She had perhaps 20 minutes before the Lord's formal address concluded, and the gathering broke into the informal reception that would follow. 20 minutes in which the hall would still be structured enough that Lord Davin could not move openly against her, without creating a scene in front of the Alpha King's own retinue. She used the time. The servant passages behind the convocation hall connected, if you knew which turns to take, to the administrative wing where the gathering's official documentation was being processed and sealed. She had learned this from the senior steward, who had told her more than he intended simply by being helpful, and not paying close enough attention to what she was actually asking. People rarely did with her. The unremarkable woman in the gray cloak, the voice gift performer. No threat. She found the document room on the second attempt. A low-ceilinged chamber with a single clerk still working by candlelight, transcribing the day's territorial acknowledgments into the formal record. He looked up when she entered, startled. "I need to see the Ashford Compact," she said. The secondary transfer documents filed under Lord Davin's Northern Reaches submission. The clerk blinked. "Those are sealed pending. I am Bonnie of Ashford," she said, "daughter of Lord Edric Ashford, whose bloodline those documents concern. Under gathering protocol, a named party in any territorial compact has the right to review documentation before the king's seal is applied." She had no certainty that this protocol existed. She had constructed it from the logic of what ought to exist in a system that pretended to be just, and she delivered it with the exact confidence of someone reading from a statute. The clerk hesitated, then pulled a folio from the stack at his left hand and placed it on the table. She read quickly. It was worse than she had understood from the corridor. Not just the land grants. Maris had been thorough. The document transferred not only the Ashford Forest holdings and river territory, but the naming rights to the bloodline itself. If this was sealed, Bonnie would not merely lose her inheritance. She would lose her legal identity as an Ashford. The name would transfer to Maris's line, and Bonnie would become, in the eyes of pack law, an unaffiliated Omega, with no territory, no alpha, no standing, and no legal mechanism to contest anything. She would be erased. She stood over the document in the candlelit room and felt the full weight of what 4 years of patient maneuvering had built toward. Maris had not done this in anger or desperation. She had done it with the slow deliberateness of someone who had always intended this outcome, and had simply waited for the right occasion to formalize it. The King's Gathering was not an opportunity Maris had exploited. It was the destination she had been navigating toward the entire time. Bonnie straightened. "This document contains a named party transfer that has not been witnessed by the named party," she said to the clerk. "That renders it procedurally incomplete under gathering law. It cannot be forwarded for the King's seal in its current form." The clerk looked at her, then at the document, then back at her. "I'll need that noted in the record," she added. He wrote it down. She was not certain it would hold, was not certain of anything in the next few hours except the immediate necessity of each action. But a notation in the official record was better than nothing. It was a thread. Small, but real. She left the document room and walked back toward the main hall. The formal address was concluding. She could hear the shift in the crowd's register, the particular loosening that came when ceremony gave way to movement, when 400 people who had been sitting in formal arrangement began to rise and rearrange themselves into the more fluid geometry of a reception. Servants moved along the walls with trays. The harps in the gallery had resumed a lighter background arrangement. She was moving through the eastern antechamber when she heard her name. Not called, said, quietly, to someone else. Behind a partially closed door to her left, Maris and Lord Davin. And a third voice she didn't recognize. She stopped, pressed herself to the wall beside the door, and breathed. Completely out of control, she was told specifically, it doesn't matter what she was told. Davin's voice, tight with something that was not quite anger, but was adjacent to it. The performance is done. The issue is the document room. Harwin says she went in. Did she see it? She saw it, and she spoke to the clerk. A silence. Then Maris, very controlled. It won't matter. The notation is procedural. Davin's advocate can have it dismissed before morning. The advocate can have it dismissed, the third voice said. Male, older, careful. But not if the king's attention has already been drawn to the Ashford name. Another silence. Longer. The performance, Maris said, and now there was something in her voice that Bonnie had never heard there before. Not anger, not calculation, but the sharp particular edge of a plan encountering unexpected resistance. Who approved Nara's lament? No one approved it. She changed the program. She has no authority to change. She changed it, Davin said flatly. And the king listened to every note of it. Harwin says he hasn't looked away from the stage entrance since she walked off. A pause. He's asking about her. The silence that followed was of a completely different quality than the ones before it. Bonnie stood in the antechamber with her back against the cold stone wall, and her heart beating in a rhythm that was steady and fast, and completely unlike fear. It was closer to the feeling she had standing on the stage before the final movement, the sense of standing at an irreversible threshold, of having already crossed it. She pushed off the wall and walked, not back toward the servant passages, not toward any exit, toward the main hall, toward the reception, the crowd, the torchlight, and whatever was on the other side of the decision she had already made by standing on that stage. She found him before she expected to. The crowd in the reception hall had rearranged itself the way crowds always rearrange themselves around genuine power, not pressing close, but orienting, leaving space that was not quite empty, just carefully maintained. She was navigating through the outer edge of this invisible geometry when the crowd shifted and she found herself in a gap of 4 feet of unoccupied floor, and on the other side of it was the Alpha King. He was standing rather than sitting now, taller than the carved chair had suggested, which was already tall. 2 of his guard were positioned a few steps behind him, but he himself was not performing the reception. He was simply present in it, holding a cup he wasn't drinking from, and he was looking directly at her with the same gray-eyed steadiness he had brought to the stage. Up close, the scar along his left jaw was visible, a thin old line that ran from the corner of his mouth toward his ear. His braids were pulled back tightly enough that the structure of his face was fully visible. Hard lines, clean angles, nothing softened by the amber light into anything other than what it was. He was perhaps 30, perhaps older. It was difficult to tell with men whose authority had been absolute long enough to replace ordinary aging. He spoke first. "You changed the program," he said. Not an accusation. A statement of fact, delivered with the same calm he probably brought to everything. "I did," Bonnie said. "You were instructed to sing something else." "I was." She kept her voice level. "I chose not to." Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. More like the recognition of something he had been waiting to confirm. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at terrain maps or treaty documents, with complete attention and no visible judgment yet. "Nara's Lament," he said. "I haven't heard it performed in full in 20 years. My father's coronation." He paused. "You didn't sing it like someone performing it. You sang it like someone who needed it." Bonnie said nothing. She was not going to deny that. "Lord Davin presented the Ashford Compact to my administrative secretary this afternoon," Lucian said, his voice dropping slightly, not in secrecy, but in precision. "There is a notation on the secondary transfer indicating procedural incompletion." "Yes," she said. "I put it there." His eyes moved over her face, unhurried, taking inventory of something she couldn't fully identify. Not attraction, not pity, not the calculation she had seen in Davin's face. Something more like the expression of a man who has encountered a problem he finds genuinely interesting. "Tell me about the Ashford land grants," he said. And Bonnie, standing in the amber torchlight of a crowded reception hall with Lord Davin somewhere behind her left shoulder, and Maris somewhere behind her right, with her father's bronze pin at her collarbone, and her voice still warm from Nara's Lament, looked at the Alpha King and made the second irreversible decision of the evening. She told him everything. Not quickly, not frantically. The way her father had taught her to present a case, with clarity and sequence, without begging. The land grants, the timber contracts already dissolved, the 4 years of methodical asset removal, the document that would erase her name, the performance designed to manufacture her consent. Lucian listened without interrupting. When she finished, the reception murmured around them, entirely unaware of what had just been said in the 4 feet of space between a dispossessed Omega and the king whose seal had almost been used to erase her. "You have no pack standing," he said, not unkindly, factually. "No," she agreed. "No Alpha advocate, no legal witness to the original grants. My father's steward, if he's still alive and willing." Lucian was quiet for a moment. His thumb moved once against the side of the cup he wasn't drinking from, the only visible sign that he was thinking, rather than simply being still. "Lord Davin's advocate will move to dismiss the procedural notation before the morning session," he said. "I know," Bonnie said. "If that happens, the compact closes and the transfer is permanent under gathering law." "I know," she said again. He looked at her. "You came to me anyway. You were the only authority in the room that Davin and my stepmother hadn't already purchased," she said simply. Something moved in his face then. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. Something in the region of the eyes rather than the mouth. It lasted only a moment. Then it was replaced by something quieter and more considered. "Go to the Eastern guest suite," he said. "Tell the guard at the door that the king extended accommodation to the Ashford voice gift. Stay there tonight. Don't go back to the delegation room." Bonnie looked at him. "And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," Lucian said, "we will discuss what the law actually says about bloodline land grants when a named heir files a direct challenge at a king's gathering." He paused. "It says considerably more than Lord Davin's advocate is going to want it to say." He turned back to the reception. Conversation over, not dismissively, but with the completeness of a man who made decisions and then moved to enact them without ceremony. Bonnie stood for one moment in the space he had occupied. Then she walked toward the eastern corridor, her boots steady on the stone floor, the bronze pin cool at her collarbone, and something in her chest that was not safety. It was too early for that. Far too early. But was the first solid thing she had felt since she pressed her back against a cold wall and heard her own name used as collateral. It was the possibility of a floor beneath this. It would have to be enough for tonight. She did not sleep well, but she slept. The Eastern guest suite was nothing like the low-ceilinged room Maris had assigned the Ashford delegation. It was a proper chamber, high-windowed, with a wide bed under a canopy of dark wool, and a fireplace that had been recently laid and lit by someone who knew what they were doing. The logs were dry oak, and they burned with the clean, steady heat of wood that had been seasoned properly, not the damp, half-hearted warmth of Ashford Keep in winter. Someone had placed a pitcher of water and a covered plate of bread and cold meat on the small table near the fire. A nightgown had been folded over the end of the bed. Plain linen, clean, smelling of lavender, and the particular mineral sharpness of water drawn from a stone well. Bonnie sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before she lay down. Long enough for the fire to settle from its initial height into the lower, steadier burn of established coals. She sat with her father's bronze pin in her palm and looked at the fire and thought about what morning would bring. She had no illusions about what she had walked into. A king's attention was not inherently protection. It was interest. An interest from a man of Lucian's position could resolve itself in any number of directions, some of which would leave her in a worse position than she had started. She had told him the truth because she had nothing left to lose by it, not because she trusted him. Trust was a thing that needed time and evidence, and she had known him for the length of one reception and 4 feet of torchlit floor. But she had watched his face while she spoke. The steadiness of it. The absence of performance. He had not reached for reassurance or sympathy or the practiced warmth that powerful men often deployed to make themselves seem safe. He had listened with the quality of attention she associated with people who actually intended to act on what they heard. It was not enough to trust, but it was something to work with. She lay down and closed her eyes, and the pressure that had lived behind her sternum for 3 days was gone, replaced by something she couldn't name yet, an alertness that was not anxiety, just readiness. The fire crackled. Outside the high windows, the wind moved through the pines surrounding Thornfield's walls with a sound like breathing. She slept. Morning came gray and cold. The light through the shuttered windows, the flat pewter color of overcast sky, before the sun had fully committed to rising. Bonnie was awake before the fire had died entirely, dressing in the same linen dress and refastening the blue wool across her shoulder. Her braid had loosened in the night, and she redid it with quick, practiced hands, pulling it tight from the crown and working down, the familiar repetitive motion of it, something close to steadying. The guard outside her door, one of Lucian's men, identifiable by the iron mark insignia on his leather vambrace, confirmed that she was expected in the king's council room at the first morning bell. She was there before the bell finished. The council room was smaller than she had expected. A working room, not a ceremonial one, a long table of scarred dark wood covered in maps and folded documents, 4 chairs on each side and one at the head, a fire already burning, and the smell of pine resin and ink and the particular dusty sharpness of old parchment that she associated with her father's library. 2 of Lucian's advisors were already present when she arrived. Older men, careful-faced, who looked at her with the measured assessment of people who had learned not to show surprise. Lucian arrived 3 minutes later. He was dressed differently than the night before, simpler, if that was possible. Dark wool, leather bracers, no fur mantle. A man dressed for work rather than ceremony. He sat at the head of the table and placed a folio in front of him that she recognized, even from her seat at the table's side, as the Ashford Compact documents. Lord Davin's advocate filed for dismissal of the procedural notation at dawn, he said without preamble, as expected. Also as expected, said one of the advisors, a lean, white-haired man named Corvin, as she would come to know him. The advocate's argument has a significant problem. He placed a second document on the table, older, the parchment slightly yellowed at the edges. The original Ashford land grants, Corvin said, were filed under the Iron Crown's foundational territorial charter, not under Pack Compact law. That means any transfer of those grants requires not just Pack witness, but Crown witness. A named heirs challenge filed at a king's gathering triggers an automatic Crown review. He looked at Bonnie. Which you did, effectively, when you spoke to the king last night. Lord Davin's advocate doesn't know this? Bonnie asked. Lord Davin's advocate knows Pack Compact law very well, Corvin said. He knows foundational charter law considerably less well. It's a specialty that most practitioners find tedious. The faintest suggestion of dry satisfaction crossed his face. It is not something I find tedious. Bonnie looked at Lucian. He was watching her. That same quality of attention, neither warm nor cold, simply complete. He had let Corvin present the information without interruption, without the performance of magnanimity that lesser powerful men use to make themselves seem generous. He had simply made the information available and waited to see how she received it. "What does Crown Review mean, practically?" she asked. "It means the compact cannot be sealed without my authorization," Lucian said. "And I won't authorize it." He paused. "The transfer of bloodline naming rights is not something this crown has ever sanctioned through secondary compact. Your stepmother's advocate missed that entirely. Lord Davins did not, which tells me Davin knew the document was overreaching and filed it anyway, expecting the gathering's pace to prevent close review." "It nearly did," Bonnie said. "It nearly did," he agreed. Silence. The fire burned. Outside, Thornfield was waking. She could hear the stable yard, horses and voices, and the particular percussion of a keep returning to its daily rhythm. "My stepmother," Bonnie said carefully. "And Davin. What happens to them?" Lucian looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. That precursor to consideration look, as though he was deciding how much of his thinking to show her. "That depends on what you want," he said. "The law gives you several options." What she wanted was a more complicated question than it had been 3 days ago. 3 days ago, she had wanted to be left alone in the modest remnants of her father's house, to build something small and sustainable from what remained. That wanting felt very far away now, not because it had been replaced by something grander, but because the house it had been attached to no longer existed. Maris had hollowed it completely, and what Bonnie was sitting across from now was not a house to return to, but a choice about what came next. "I want the land grants restored to the Ashford bloodline," she said. "My name on them, legally, with Crown witness. I want the timber contracts my stepmother dissolved, reviewed for unlawful transfer. If they were, I want the revenue assessed against her estate." She paused. "And I want Davin's compact, voided in its entirety. Not dismissed on a technicality, voided. On the record." Corvin was writing. Lucian had not looked away from her. "Maris," she said, and the name came out flatter than she intended, stripped of the complicated sorrow she had carried for it across 4 years of cold mornings, in a house that had stopped being home the day her father died. "I don't want her imprisoned. I want her removed from Ashford Keep. I want the record to show why, and I want her to know that the document she used my voice to make legitimate, the performance she turned into false consent, is the same document that brought the king's attention to everything she had done. She let that land. I want her to understand," Bonnie said quietly, "that the song she told me to sing small is the reason she lost everything." The room was very quiet. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression had shifted, not to softness, but to something that was perhaps the thing underneath steadiness, when steadiness had been maintained long enough to trust itself. A kind of recognition. "Done," he said. Looked at Corvin. "Draft the Crown Review findings. I'll sign before the morning session." Corvin left. The second advisor followed. And Bonnie sat across from the Alpha King in a working room that smelled of pine resin and ink, with the gray morning light coming through the high windows, and felt the particular rearrangement of the world that happens when a thing you were braced for, a blow, a loss, a door closing, does not happen, when the floor holds. "You have no pack standing," Lucian said again. The same words as the night before, but different in register, not laying out a limitation, she realized now. Something else. "No," she said, still true. "Ashford's restored grants need an Alpha's co-signature to be legally active under the current territorial framework," he said. "That's not a technicality. That's the structure." A pause. "It doesn't have to be permanent. A formal affiliation, an Alpha vouching for the bloodline's legitimacy and territorial right, would satisfy the requirement." She understood what he was offering. understood also what he was carefully not offering, not presenting it as more than it was, not dressing it in something that would require her to refuse it on principle. A formal affiliation. Clean, legal, bounded. Why? She asked, directly, because she was done with questions whose answers she was supposed to infer. Lucian was quiet for a moment. The fire settled in the grate. Because the law should not be available only to people who already have everything, he said. And because your father filed those grants under this crown's charter, that makes them this crown's responsibility. He looked at her steadily. And because I have spent 20 years watching people with power use ceremony as a tool against people who have none, I find I have very little patience left for it. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise of anything beyond what he had already offered. But it was honest. The particular honesty of someone who had stopped needing to perform their own goodness and had simply arrived at it as a matter of practice. Bonnie looked at him across the scarred dark table with the morning light on his face, and her father's bronze pin at her collarbone, and the full weight of the last 3 days settling into something she could actually stand on. "All right," she said. "Then we proceed." What followed was neither swift nor simple, because justice rarely is. The Crown review of the Ashford Compact took 4 days. Corvin was methodical and thorough, and Lord Davin's advocate, faced with foundational charter law he had genuinely not anticipated, spent those 4 days in increasingly frantic consultation with colleagues who could not help him. On the 3rd day, Davin himself requested a private audience with the king and was declined. On the 4th day, the compact was voided, on the record, in full, exactly as Bonnie had asked. The timber contract review took longer, 3 weeks, conducted by Corvin's office while Bonnie remained at Thornfield as a formal guest of the Crown. She used the time in the castle's library, which was extraordinary, floor to ceiling with volumes she had never had access to, and she read Pack Territorial Law with the focused intensity of someone building a wall, stone by stone, against the possibility of ever being in this position again. Maris left Ashford Keep on a cold morning in the 4th week, escorted by 2 of Lucian's guard, and carrying only what could be demonstrated to have been brought into the marriage. She said nothing when she left, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever done. The record of her actions was filed under the Iron Crown's territorial archive, not hidden, not softened. Present, for anyone who needed to know what had happened in the Ashford lands and who had made it happen. Lord Davin lost the Northern Reaches Compact entirely. The voiding of the Ashford document triggered a review of his other territorial filings, 2 of which contained similar overreaches against smaller bloodlines. He spent the following year in legal proceedings that Corvin described, without visible emotion, as thorough. Bonnie's father's steward, an old man named Pell, who had retired to his daughter's farm in the valley below the keep when Maris made the house untenable, was located and brought to Thornfield to provide witness testimony for the land grant restoration. He wept when he saw her. She held his hands and did not tell him it was all right, because it had not been all right. And he had lived through the not all right of it too. She told him it was finished. That was true, and it was enough. The Ashford grants were restored to the bloodline in the 5th week. Bonnie's name on them, Crown witnessed, with Lucian's co-signature in the formal affiliation capacity, exactly as he had described. Clean, legal, bounded. She signed her own name next to her father's name on the restoration document, and the bronze pin at her collarbone was very cold and very still. And she did not cry, though she came close. She stayed at Thornfield longer than strictly necessary. She told herself it was practical. There was much to arrange before she could return to Ashford, staff to hire, the keep to be assessed for what Maris had left in usable condition. These things were true. They were not the whole truth. The whole truth included the library and the mornings she spent in it. It included Corvin, who turned out to have a dry and precise sense of humor she found unexpectedly welcome. It included the strange piece of a keep that ran on competence rather than performance, where things happened because they were necessary, rather than because someone needed to be seen making them happen. It included Lucian, who appeared in the library on the 7th morning and sat across from her at the reading table without particular ceremony, and asked what she was studying and listened when she told him. Who appeared again on the 9th morning and the 11th, and on the 14th, brought a volume from his own collection that was directly relevant to what she'd mentioned 2 days before, and set it beside her current book without comment, and sat down to his own work. She was not foolish enough to call it simple. Nothing about it was simple. He was the Alpha King, and she was a restored but minor bloodline Omega, with no pack standing, and a keep that needed 3 months of practical work before it would be genuinely habitable. The distance between those two positions was not a thing that evaporated, because a man was steady, and a woman had finally found solid ground. But she had spent 23 years learning to observe clearly. And what she observed, across those mornings in the library, and the occasional evenings when she attended the castle's informal dinner and found herself in conversation with him, was a man who was interested in her mind, who did not require her to be smaller than she was, who had, on the occasion when she had been sharp with him over a point of territorial law she felt he was dismissing too quickly, responded not with authority, but with an actual counter-argument. And then, when she dismantled it, had looked at her with something that was plainly and unperformatively pleased. She had not been looked at that way in a very long time. On the morning she finally announced she was ready to return to Ashford, she stood in the library with her traveling cloak over her arm and her saddlebag packed, and the bronze pin at her collarbone. And Lucian stood by the window with his hands at his sides, and the gray morning light on his face. And neither of them said anything for a moment that was slightly too long to be accidental. "The keep will need a formal pack affiliation eventually," he said. "Beyond the temporary co-signature. Something permanent." "I know," she said. "That's a conversation for another time." "It is," she agreed. He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning light moved. "Sing again," he said, "when you have something that deserves the room." She thought of Nara's lament, of the stage, of standing at a frozen river's edge and choosing to keep walking, of what it meant that she was walking away from this keep toward her own land with her name on it, and the floor solid beneath her feet. "I will," she said. She returned to Ashford in the first week of true spring, when the mud had firmed enough for the cartwheels and the forest was beginning its slow, annual insistence on green. Old Pell met her at the gate with 2 hired women from the valley and a list of what needed doing, which was long and honest and not frightening, because now she had the resources to address it. The keep smelled of cold stone and abandonment and possibility. She walked through it room by room and opened the shutters and let the light in, and in her father's library, where the fireplace was dark and the bookshelves were bare. She stood for a long time in the gray spring light and let herself feel all of it. The loss, the 4 years, the morning in the corridor, the stage, the song, the table in the council room where she had finally said what she needed and been heard. She was not the same person who had stood in this room as a child with her father's hand on her shoulder, learning to hold fire in cupped hands. She was not the person who had endured Maris's careful erasure of everything this room had meant. She was something new, built from both, and belonging entirely to neither. A woman with her name on her own land, her voice still warm from the most important performance she would ever give, and a door, carefully, honestly, unhurriedly, left open. She built a fire in her father's library. It caught on the first attempt, clean and steady, the dry wood her father had always insisted on keeping properly stacked. The light spread across the empty shelves and the cold stone floor, and the bare desk where he had sat and taught her. And Bonnie stood in the warmth of it, and let herself feel, beneath everything else, what had been true since the morning she pressed her back against a cold wall and refused to become invisible. She was still here. She had not been finished. And the song, when it came, and it would come, when the room was ready, when the right stage stood before her again, would be something no one had told her to sing. Something entirely her own.